My interest in travel probably came about from the history courses I took in middle school and in high school, particularly ancient history, Egyptian, Greek, Persian, those countries and their battles and the sites that are still available to look at. So anyhow, I dreamed about this as a kid. Being a Depression kid, there was no way I could ever afford at that point in life to take trips. So I decided that I would have to get a job that would allow me to travel, to afford to travel. And so I became a professor, and it wasn't just for that I became a professor, but that was one of the perks, particularly with sabbaticals and summers off. And I helped develop a study abroad program at Clemson University, and I was fortunate enough to have a Fulbright fellowship to Ireland one year. Anyhow, I also did consulting work here and abroad, and that gave me a chance to do some foreign travel. In any event, when I was in college, I bought an old junk car for $25, and I was the only guy amongst the three of us buddies who had a car, and they wanted to go to Lauderdale, Fort Lauderdale in spring break, where all the action was. And I didn't particularly want to go, but I had the car. So they plied me with gas and other perks, and so we went to Fort Lauderdale. When we got to the hotel down there was an ad on the bulletin board for a round-trip flight from Key West to Havana for $50 on Q Airlines, old DC-3 Airlines. So when we saw that ad, I convinced one of the guys to go with me, and the other two stayed and lollygagged on the beach. The trip to Cuba was uneventful, about an hour-and-a-half flight, about 90 miles by air. And the minute we got off the plane, we were assailed by people trying to sign us up for a tour. They wanted to be our private tour guide, and there were 6 guys that got a hold of us before we even got down the ladder off the plane. So we chose the lesser of the 6 evils, and he took us around and showed us the Moro Castle and the usual things. But it was study in depravity. There was kids following you the whole time, begging money off of your cigarettes, or kids trying to sell their madre, mi sister, oso señor, you know, and it was, and of course they were standing off the side. And then there were kids trying to sell you castanets and maracas and bongos and whatever, and they would carve your name in it if you made the mistake of telling what your first name was. They'd have it carved in there before you could finish saying your name. So, but it was a real eye-opener if you've never been to a situation like that before. And so and we went to the Hotel Nacional, where the big casino was that was run by the mafia, and the mafia pretty much controlled Fulgencio Batista, who was the dictator of Cuba. And so it was pretty understandable why somebody like Castro could take over. It was interesting, the 2 nights that we were there, you could hear fire in the alleyways at night, and we asked about that, and they said it was probably Castro's lieutenants coming in, just raising some havoc for fear purposes. And so we wanted adventure, but we didn't want to be in the middle of a revolution. So 2 nights, 3 days was enough. The next time that I went overseas was when I was a professor, and it was 1969. And at that time, you could fly to the furthest point in Europe, and you could take all the side trips you wanted for nothing, short of that distant trip that you picked. So I chose Berlin as my distant point, furthest point, and So we went to London, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Paris, then to Berlin. And in Berlin, I had to make other arrangements because I was in communist territory. So I got a plane out of East Germany to Prague, and then from Prague to Vienna, I took a train. And in Vienna, then we went to Rome and Madrid. So it was very varied. It was kind of like that old movie, if it's Tuesday, it must be Belgium type thing in some cases. But that was all right. I got to whet my appetite. Whenever I travel to foreign countries, I like to visit in a working home, not just touristy trap, but a real working home. And the first time this happened was in Osaka, Japan, and this is the story that is in the Mensa Bulletin. This came about because I asked the concierge at the hotel we were staying if there were any tours that visited real working homes meaning where real people were doing real things, not putting on an act for us. And he said he was not aware of that. And I asked him if he knew of a family that would let us visit, and he said that he would ask his parents, but he thought not, because his dad had fought the Americans during the Second World War, and he hated Americans. And he said he didn't think this would work too well. But I said, well, just ask, and so on. So anyhow, he went home, and the next day he called the room and he said that his mother had convinced his father to let us come for a visit. And he was going to be there himself with his family so he could translate for us, because they spoke no English and we spoke no Japanese other than sayonara. And so we went there, and unfortunately the concierge had to leave immediately because there was some business back at the hotel that came up, and so here we were with a language problem. But it worked out well. I won't spoil the story for you, but it was a very interesting situation. Since then, I have visited with other families where they could not speak my language and I could not speak their language, and we had a delightful time. One time in particular was in Italy when my car broke down and I had to go to a local mechanic, and he spoke no English and I spoke no Italian, and we had to stay over, and so he invited us to his house for supper, and he had a little boy and a wife, and we just used sign language to kind of communicate, and it was a delightful 3 hour evening. I haven't kept up with the people who I have visited in most cases. The Italian mechanic and I corresponded for a couple years after that because he was interested in antique cars, and I had the same interest at that time. And so we swapped pictures back and forth of cars that we were working on or owned or saw or whatever. But none of the other families have I kept up with. I'm not sure. I've probably been in 6 to 8 different homes in different countries, visiting with people, real people, in working homes. They all came about in a different way. The one in Beijing was actually part of a tour. That was the only tour that we ever did. We got to have tea and crumpets in a private home. But other places where I was living, it made it a lot easier to visit with people in their homes. when I was living in Berlin and Italy and Belgium and Ireland and England and so on. There's no trick to that. But when you're on tours, you have to be lucky. You have to ask the tour people that you're with if there's any way you could visit at home, and that's probably not possible because they're not set up for doing that type of thing. And then sometimes you just meet people. When you have times off, a lot of tours you have days off or half days off, and you can go out and do what you want. And it's been very rewarding, and I still like to do it. Over the 50-some years that I've been traveling, I have visited 78 different countries, and I have kept a record, a diary you might say, of interesting things that have happened to me over the years. And here in the last 2 years, I decided to put this together into a book, which I called Travels and Tribulations, a memoir. And the Cuban story that I just related and the Japanese story are included in this book. It's not the kind of book where I recommend restaurants or hotels or any of that kind of stuff. There are thousands of books that do that. This is just talking about people I met, situations that I was involved in that was off the beaten path. People ask what was my most rewarding trip, and I would have to say from a personal point of view, it was probably the story that I've written for Mensa Bulletin. But as far as adventure goes, I would say it was the consulting job that I did for the Zambian government back in 1998. But the side trips that I took, I went to Victoria Falls and flew down into the falls on an ultralight plane, which was very thrilling. I wanted to go whitewater rafting at the base of the falls, but they were having a monsoon period and the water was too dangerous, so they shut down the whitewater rafting. That was sad because I only had one chance at that. But I did fly then to Lake Victoria, which was in Uganda. Victoria Falls was in Zambia, and Lake Victoria is in Uganda, about 1,000 miles north. And I found when I got there, and did not know ahead of time, that they had whitewater rafting off the dam that overflows Lake Victoria and becomes the Nile. And so I had a very interesting experience there. All of this, of course, is in Travels and Tribulations. But I suppose, adventure-wise, the Zambian trip was the most rewarding. I here recently, in fact, just came out in the last couple weeks, my first and maybe only children's book called Bullette and Jessica. It's a story about my dog's adventures with various animals in the woods. Very comical, most of it. And it's a composite. It's listed as fiction, but it's actually based on 3 dogs that I own and various things that they did. And